The bombing attack on Dresden, Germany, stands among the most controversial Allied actions over World War II. From February 13th to 15, 1945, 800 bombers dropped some 2,700 tons of explosives and incendiaries, decimating the German city. Tens of thousands died. American prisoners of war had heard the G-Urhump, a Wumpgeur of distant aerial bombings many times before. But on February 13th, 1945, they heard Dresden-Geur, TM's fire sirens howl right above their heads. German guards moved them 2 stories down into a meat locker. When they came back to the surface, Goethe City was gone. Geur remembered writer and social critic Kurt Vonnegut-Geur, one of the American POWs who witnessed the Dresden bombing. Why was Dresden so heavily bombed? The punishing 3-day Allied bombing attack, intended to force a German surrender, leveled the city and left tens of thousands dead. The bombing attack on Dresden, Germany, stands among the most controversial Allied actions of a World War II. From February 13th to 15, 1945, 800 bombers dropped some 2,700 tons of explosives and incendiaries, decimating the German city. Tens of thousands died. American prisoners of war had heard the G-Urhump, a Wumpgeur of distant aerial bombings many times before. But on February 13th, 1945, they heard Dresden-Geur, TM's fire sirens, howl right above their heads. German guards moved them 2 stories down into a meat locker. When they came back to the surface, Goethe City was gone. Geur remembered writer and social critic Kurt Vonnegut-Geur, one of the American POWs who witnessed the Dresden bombing. Since Dresden served as a major center for a Nazi Germany, Geur TM's rail and road network, its destruction was intended to overwhelm German authorities and services Geur, and to clog all transportation routes with throngs of refugees. The Allied assault came less than a month after some 19,000 US troops were killed in Germany's last-ditch offensive at the Battle of the Bulge, and 3 weeks after the grim discovery of the atrocities committed by Nazi forces at Auschwitz. In an effort to force a surrender, the Dresden bombing was intended to terrorize the civilian population locally and nationwide. It certainly had that effect. Dresden bombing, a barrage of explosives and incendiaries. In the time that Vonnegut and others hid underground, the British Bomber Command Geur, TM-SA Blind Illuminatora aircraft had rained explosives and incendiaries over the city. Then, Geur Visual Marker Geur aircraft swooped low to drop thousands of flares and fire target markers. The main attack formation followed. Over 500 heavy Geur-Lancaster-Geur bombers loaded with explosives and incendiaries. The US 8th Air Force attacked the next day with another 400 tons of bombs and launched yet another raid with 210 bombers on February 15th. With the Germana Luftwaffe destroyed and anti-aircraft defenses in shambles, the Royal Air Force lost only 6 planes. On the ground, however, thousands of small fires merged into a powerful firestorm that created such powerful winds that it sucked oxygen, fuel, broken structures, and people into its flames. It is estimated there were around 30,000 civilian deaths in the 4 Dresden raids, although historians cannot agree, and some estimates are considerably higher. The numbers were difficult to accurately assess because of the high number of refugees in the city at that time. For an increasing number of people in the West, Dresden was one bombing raid too many. The point-blank directive, June 1942, of the Allied High Command had agreed that bombing targets of military and strategic value was the priority over civilian targets in preparation for the forthcoming land operations in Europe, although the directive was ambiguous since it did include lowering civilian morale as a legitimate objective. Perhaps the proximity to the closing stages of the war affected public opinion more than the earlier raids had done. At the end of the war, Harris became something of a scapegoat for the area bombing campaign, despite the obvious fact that others had repeatedly supported the execution of the strategy. It was true that some high-level commanders had preferred to attack targets specifically connected to Germany's oil supply, and there were still others who wished to attack only transport networks, but the majority had gone along with the area bombing campaign. Harris remained convinced of the validity of bombing cities as the best way to ultimately lessen the inevitable casualties of land operations, commenting that he did not consider the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier, Dear 242. Despite the moral questions posed following the Dresden raid, that city was not to be the last to be heavily bombed in the war. In 1945, many Japanese cities faced equally massive and even more destructive bombing raids as the US sought to avoid a dangerous and lengthy land invasion, a campaign of calculated terror which culminated in the total devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki using atomic bombs.